Widow fed herself, became her mother. Lakota warrior begged for milk for his dying baby. Sarah Mitchell sat by the small window of her cabin, watching snow fall across the empty prairie. She was 28 years old, but she felt ancient. Her hands, rough and calloused from work, rested on her growing belly. 6 months had passed since the Army officers came to her door with the news that changed everything. Her husband, James Mitchell, would not be coming home. He had fallen during one of the battles in the Great Sioux War. The officers were polite but brief. They handed her a folded flag and his personal belongings in a small cloth bag. Then they left her alone in the cabin James had built with his own hands. Sarah remembered the day they arrived in the Dakota Territory. It was spring, and the land seemed full of promise. James had been so excited about their future. He talked about the farm they would build, the children they would raise, the life they would create together. He enlisted in the cavalry because the pay helped them survive those first difficult years. He promised it would only be temporary. Now Sarah was alone. The cabin felt too big and too small at the same time. Every corner held memories of James. His coat still hung by the door. His tools sat in the corner waiting for hands that would never hold them again. At night, Sarah talked to him as if he could hear her. She told him about the baby, about her fears, about how much she missed him. The women from the settlement visited sometimes. They brought food and kind words. Mrs. Peterson, the blacksmith's wife, told Sarah she was strong and would get through this. Miss Clara, the schoolteacher, offered to help with anything Sarah needed, but their visits became less frequent as winter deepened. Everyone had their own struggles. The winter was harsh, and survival took all their energy. Sarah tried to keep the farm running. She fed the chickens, though half of them had died in the cold. She chopped wood, though her pregnant belly made it harder each day. She melted snow for water and rationed the food supplies James had stored before he left. Some days, she wondered how she would make it through to spring. The baby kicked inside her, and Sarah placed her hand on her belly. This child was all she had left of James. She talked to the baby, too, telling stories about its father. She described James's smile, his laugh, the way he sang off-key when he thought no one was listening. She promised the baby that even though it would never meet its father, it would know him through her stories. December turned to January. The cold became brutal. Maybe Sarah kept the fire burning day and night, watching her wood supply shrink. She ate less to make the food last longer. The baby moved less frequently, and Sarah worried. She had no doctor nearby, no midwife she trusted. The closest help was Mrs. Peterson, who had delivered babies before, but she lived 3 miles away. In this weather, 3 miles might as well be 30. The pain started on a dark January night. Sarah knew immediately something was wrong. The contractions came too early and too hard. She tried to reach the door to call for help, but the snow was too deep, the night too dark, and the pain too intense. She collapsed by the fireplace, alone and terrified. The hours that followed were a blur of pain and prayers. Sarah called out for James, for her mother who died years ago, for anyone who might hear. But there was only the wind howling outside and the crackling of the fire. She gripped the edge of James's old blanket and pushed when her body told her to push. When the baby finally came, the cabin fell silent. Too silent. Sarah held the tiny still form in her trembling hands. A boy. He looked like James. But he did not cry. He did not breathe. Sarah tried everything she could think of. She rubbed his back, cleared his mouth, held him close to warm him. Nothing worked. As dawn broke, Sarah wrapped her son in the softest cloth she owned. She held him for hours, rocking back and forth, singing the lullabies she had practiced for months. She named him James, after his father. She told him about the man he was named for, about the grandfather he would have loved, about the life he should have had. The ground was too frozen to dig. Sarah kept her son's body in a wooden box James had made for storing vegetables. She placed it in the coldest part of the cabin and tried not to think about what she would do when the ground thawed. The thought of burying both her husband and her son in the same year was more than she could bear. But Sarah's body did not understand her grief. Her milk came in. Her breasts became swollen and painful. She had prepared to feed a hungry baby, but there was no baby to feed. The physical pain joined her emotional agony. She tried the remedies the women had mentioned, cold compresses, tight binding, herbs if she had them. Nothing truly helped. She sat by the window again, tears streaming down her face, her body aching with milk meant for a child who would never drink it. The cruel irony was not lost on her. Her body was ready to give life, to nourish and nurture, but she had no one to care for. The milk leaked through her clothes, a constant reminder of what she had lost. The other women came when they heard. Mrs. Peterson cried with her. Miss Clara helped clean the cabin. Reverend Clark said prayers and promised that both James, father and son, were in heaven together. Their kindness was genuine, but it could not fill the emptiness Sarah felt. Days blurred together. Sarah stopped tracking time. She did only what was necessary to survive. She fed the remaining chickens. She kept the fire burning. She ate enough to stay alive, though she had no appetite. The cabin became her prison and her refuge. Going outside meant facing a world that had continued spinning while hers had stopped. Her milk continued to come. Week after week, her body refused to accept what her mind knew. There was no baby. She would wake in the night, her clothing soaked, her body calling out for an infant who did not exist. Sometimes she thought she heard crying, only to realize it was the wind or her imagination. Sarah began to question everything. Why had she come to this territory? Why had James enlisted? Why had God taken everyone she loved? What purpose could there be in her continued existence? She had no husband, no child, no future she could imagine. The settlement women checked on her, but their visits felt like obligations rather than comfort. One afternoon, Sarah stood at the window and watched a bird struggle through the wind. It fought hard, wings beating against the brutal cold. She wondered why it bothered. Why did anything bother to keep fighting when the world was so harsh and uncaring? But the bird kept flying. It did not give up. It pushed through the wind until it found shelter in a tree near her cabin. Sarah watched it settle into the branches, ruffling its feathers, preparing to endure another freezing night. Something about that bird stayed with her. It had no guarantee of survival. It had no promise that tomorrow would be better, but it fought anyway. It endured because that is what living things do. They endure. Sarah did not feel strong. She did not feel brave. But she kept the fire burning. She kept the chickens fed. She kept living, one painful day at a time, not knowing why, but unable to stop. Her body still produced milk for a child who was gone. Her heart still beat for a future she could not see. February arrived with even colder temperatures. Sarah's supplies dwindled. Her isolation deepened. The physical pain of her milk production slowly began to ease, though it never fully stopped. Her body seemed as confused as her heart about what came next. She existed in a strange state between living and merely surviving. She spoke to James and little James as if they could hear her. She made plans she had no energy to execute. She thought about spring, though she could not imagine actually reaching it. The cabin creaked in the wind. The fire popped. Outside, the world lay frozen and white, empty of everything except cold and memory. Sarah pulled James's coat around her shoulders and closed her eyes, wondering what tomorrow might bring, unable to imagine it could bring anything but more of the same loneliness and pain that had become her entire world. Sarah stood frozen in her doorway, the rifle heavy in her hands. The cold wind rushed past the young man standing on her porch carrying snow into her cabin. His dark eyes moved from her face to the bundle he held against his chest, then back to her again. He said something in a language she did not understand, but his voice carried a desperation that needed no translation. The baby in his arms made a sound. Not quite a cry, more like a weak whimper. It was the sound of a creature too exhausted to protest its suffering. Sarah's hands tightened on the rifle, but her eyes stayed locked on that tiny bundle. The man said something else, and this time Sarah caught a word that sounded like, "Please." His lips were blue from the cold. Ice clung to his hair, and the rough blanket wrapped around the infant. He had been out in this weather for a long time, she realized. Too long. Nobody survived long and cold like this. Sarah's mind raced. Everyone knew about the tensions between the settlers and the Lakota people. The Battle of Little Bighorn had happened just months ago. General Custer had fallen. The newspapers called the Lakota warriors enemies, savages, threats to civilization. The army had been hunting them across the territory. James had died fighting in this conflict. This man standing before her could have been one of the warriors who fought against James. He could have been there when her husband fell. The thought made Sarah's finger move closer to the trigger. But then the baby whimpered again. Sarah looked at the infant's face, barely visible in the blanket. The child was dying. She had seen enough death to recognize it. The baby's lips had a blue tinge. Its movements were weak. Without help, this child would not survive the night. The man seemed to understand her hesitation. He slowly, carefully unwrapped the blanket enough to show her the baby more clearly. A girl. Tiny and fragile. Her eyes were barely open, her breathing shallow. He spoke again, more urgently now, and Sarah heard the break in his voice. She did not need to understand his language to know what he was saying. He was begging for his daughter's life. Sarah thought of little James, wrapped in soft cloth in his wooden box. She thought of her own arms, empty and aching. She thought of the milk her body still produced, wasted and painful. She thought of the bird fighting through the wind. She lowered the rifle. The man's eyes widened with hope and fear. Sarah stepped back and gestured for him to come inside. He hesitated for just a moment as if he could not believe what was happening, then stumbled through the doorway. Sarah quickly closed the door against the cold. Inside the cabin, lit by firelight, Sarah could see them both more clearly. The man was young, probably younger than James had been. His face was gaunt from hunger and exhaustion. His clothes were inadequate for the weather. He had traveled far in terrible conditions with no thought for his own survival, only for the baby's. He stood in the center of the room, shivering, still holding the infant as if afraid Sarah might change her mind. Sarah set the rifle down and moved closer. She held out her arms in the universal gesture of mothers everywhere. The man understood. Slowly, as if giving up his most precious possession, he placed the baby in Sarah's arms. The infant was so light, so cold. Sarah's heart clenched. She had held little James like this, had felt his weight in her arms, had memorized every detail of his face. This baby girl looked different, but the need was the same. Every baby needed warmth, food, comfort, love. Sarah moved to the chair by the fire and sat down. The man watched her with wide eyes, uncertain what she would do. Sarah looked down at the baby, then made a decision that would change everything. She adjusted her clothing and brought the infant to her breast. The baby did not respond at first. Sarah worried she was too weak, too far gone. But then, with an instinct older than language or culture or conflict, the infant latched on. She began to drink. The man made a sound, half sob, half prayer. He sank to his knees, his entire body shaking. Whether from cold or emotion or relief, Sarah could not tell. Probably all three. Sarah focused on the baby. She felt the familiar pull and release as the infant nursed. Her body, which had been producing milk with no purpose for weeks, finally had a reason. The pain she had been experiencing began to ease as the baby drank. It felt right in a way nothing had felt right since she lost her own son. The baby drank for a long time. When she finally stopped, her color looked slightly better. She was not healed, not saved yet, but she had a chance. Sarah wrapped her more securely in the blanket and held her close to keep her warm. The man was still on his knees, looking up at Sarah with an expression of profound gratitude. He spoke softly in his language, words Sarah did not understand, but whose meaning was clear. "Thank you. Thank you. Thank you." Sarah realized he was in almost as much danger as the baby had been. She pointed to the corner where James's bedroll still lay. The man shook his head and gestured that he would stay by the door, that he did not want to intrude. But Sarah insisted. She pointed more firmly and added wood to the fire. Reluctantly, the man moved to the bedroll. He collapsed onto it as if his legs could no longer hold him. Within minutes he was asleep, his body finally surrendering to the exhaustion he had been fighting. Sarah sat in her chair holding the sleeping baby, watching them both. What had she done? She had just brought one of the enemy into her home. She was feeding his child with the milk meant for her own lost son. If anyone found out, she would be called a traitor. She might be arrested, or worse. But looking down at the tiny face of the sleeping infant, Sarah could not bring herself to regret it. This baby was innocent. She had not chosen the conflict between their peoples. She had simply been born at the wrong time, into a world at war. Did she deserve to die because of decisions made by men in power? Did any child? The baby stirred and made a small sound. Sarah gently rocked her, humming the same lullaby she had sung to little James. The baby settled back into sleep, her breathing steadier now. Over the next few days, a strange routine developed. The man, whom Sarah learned through gestures was named Maddo, would wake and immediately check on his daughter. Sarah would nurse the baby several times a day. Between feedings, Maddo would venture out to hunt, always returning with something. A rabbit, some roots he had dug from beneath the snow, firewood he had gathered. They communicated through gestures and expressions. Maddo would point to himself and say, "Maddo," which Sarah understood was his name. He pointed to the baby and said what sounded like "Wichongan pie." Sarah repeated it carefully until he nodded with approval. She pointed to herself and said, "Sarah." Maddo repeated it, his pronunciation careful and respectful. Slowly, they began to learn each other's words. Maddo would point to the fire and say the Lakota word. Sarah would tell him the English word. They did this with everything: water, wood, snow, food. It was like teaching a child to speak, except they were both the teachers and both the students. Sarah learned that Mado's wife had died 3 days after giving birth to Wichangampai. He had been separated from his band during a military pursuit and could not reach them without endangering everyone. He had traveled to 3 different settlements before Sarah's, begging for help at each one. Every door had been slammed in his face. Some people had threatened him with guns. One man had fired a warning shot to drive him away. He had been ready to give up when he saw the light in Sarah's window. He decided to try one more time, knowing it would probably end the same way as all the others. He had expected another rejection, another gun pointed at him, another door closed in his face. Instead, he found Sarah. As Mado shared his story through broken words and gestures, Sarah felt her old beliefs crumbling. The newspapers had called these people savages, but Mado was just a father who loved his daughter. He grieved for his wife the same way Sarah grieved for James. He fought to protect his child the same way any parent would. Sarah shared her own story. She showed him the small wooden box and tried to explain about little James. Mado understood, his face filled with sorrow, and he placed his hand over his heart in a gesture Sarah recognized. Shared grief, shared loss. He said something in Lakota that sounded like a prayer or blessing. One evening, as Sarah nursed Wichungpi by the firelight, she watched Mado carving a piece of wood. His hands moved with practiced skill, and she could see a shape emerging, an animal of some kind. He worked quietly, occasionally glancing at his daughter with an expression of such love that it made Sarah's heart ache. This was supposed to be her enemy. But sitting in her cabin, watching a father create a toy for his daughter, watching a baby grow stronger on milk her own body provided, Sarah could not see an enemy. She saw a family torn apart by circumstances beyond their control. She saw people trying to survive in a harsh world. She saw humanity in its most basic form, the love between parent and child. Wichanganpi was growing stronger each day. Her color improved. She cried with more energy. She looked at Sarah with alert, curious eyes. The baby had no idea about the conflict between their peoples. She only knew that when she was hungry, Sarah fed her. When she was cold, Sarah warmed her. When she cried, Sarah comforted her. Sarah felt something awakening in herself, too. For weeks, she had been merely existing, going through the motions of survival without purpose. But now, nursing this baby, watching her grow stronger, Sarah felt useful again. Her body's milk was not being wasted. Her empty arms were full. The cabin no longer felt like a prison. Mado noticed the change in Sarah, too. He began to smile occasionally, a small expression of hope. He worked hard to help maintain the cabin, fixing things James had not had time to repair. He hunted and shared everything he caught. He was respectful of Sarah's space, always careful to show gratitude for what she was doing. But Sarah knew the situation could not last forever. Eventually someone would visit. Eventually their secret would be discovered. And when that happened, she had no idea what would come next. September arrived with cooler winds and golden prairie grass that swayed like ocean waves. Inside the cabin, Sarah sat mending a shirt while Wichungpi played on a blanket near her feet. The baby was nearly 8 months old now, healthy and strong. She babbled constantly, reaching for everything, pulling herself up on furniture. Her dark eyes sparkled with curiosity about the world around her. Mado was outside repairing the chicken coop. Sarah could hear the steady rhythm of his hammer. Over the months, he had fixed nearly everything around the homestead. The roof no longer leaked. The fence stood straight and strong. The woodpile was stocked for winter. He worked tirelessly as if trying to repay an unpayable debt. Their communication had improved dramatically. Mado now spoke simple English sentences, and Sarah had learned many Lakota words. They talked about everyday things, the weather, the chickens, what to cook for dinner, but they also shared deeper conversations about their lives before tragedy brought them together. Sarah had learned that Mado's wife, Winona, had been skilled at beadwork. She had dreamed of teaching their daughter the traditional designs passed down through generations. Mado carried one of Winona's creations, a beaded bracelet with intricate patterns in blue and white. He kept it wrapped carefully in a piece of leather, taking it out only occasionally to remember her. Mado had learned that Sarah loved to sing, that James had proposed to her under an oak tree back east, that she missed her mother's cooking and her father's terrible jokes. He had learned that Sarah was stronger than she looked, braver than she believed, and kinder than the world deserved. Their arrangement had remained secret, but barely. Sarah told the settlement women that she was managing fine alone. When anyone visited, Mado would hide in the small root cellar beneath the cabin floor. It was uncomfortable and dark, but it kept him safe. Wichanganpi had learned to be quiet during these times, as if she understood the danger. Reverend Clark had become increasingly suspicious. He noticed Sarah's improved circumstances. The repaired buildings, the well-stocked woodpile, the general air of a homestead being properly maintained. A widow alone should not be thriving like this. He had started visiting more frequently, his eyes sharp and searching. That September afternoon, Sarah heard the Reverend's wagon approaching. She quickly stood and called out to Mato. He immediately dropped his tools and ran inside. Wichangpi was playing contentedly, but Sarah knew the baby might make noise. She scooped her up and handed her to Mato. "Hurry," she whispered urgently. Mato took his daughter and disappeared down the ladder into the root cellar. Sarah closed the trapdoor and threw a rug over it. She took a deep breath, smoothed her dress, and stepped outside to greet Reverend Clark. The Reverend climbed down from his wagon, his face friendly but his eyes calculating. "Good afternoon, Sister Sarah. I thought I would check on you before the weather turns." "That is kind of you, Reverend," Sarah said, keeping her voice steady. "As you can see, I am managing well." "Indeed," he said, looking around at the neat farmyard. "Very well, it seems. The repairs to your buildings are impressive. However did you manage such work alone?" Sarah had prepared for this question. "I hired a drifter passing through last month. He needed food and a place to sleep for a few nights, so we made an arrangement. He fixed what needed fixing in exchange for meals." "A drifter?" The Reverend's eyebrows rose. "You allowed a strange man to stay on your property?" "That seems unwise for a woman alone." "He slept in the barn," Sarah lied smoothly, "and he has moved on now. But I am grateful for his help." Reverend Clark walked toward the cabin. "May I come in for some water? The ride has made me thirsty." Her heart pounded as she led him inside. The cabin looked normal, her chair, the table, the fireplace. But she could hear Wichangpi starting to fuss below the floor. The baby's muffled sounds were barely audible, but to Sarah they seemed deafening. She quickly went to the water bucket and poured a cup, talking loudly to cover any noise. "How are things in the settlement, Reverend?" "I have been so occupied here that I have not heard the latest news." The Reverend drank slowly, his eyes scanning the room. "There have been reports of Lakota people moving through the area. The army's concerned. They warn everyone to be vigilant." Below the floor, Wichangpi let out a small cry. Sarah coughed loudly at the exact same moment, but she saw the Reverend's head tilt slightly. He had heard something. "What was that sound?" he asked. "What sound?" Sarah's hands trembled as she refilled his cup. "I heard nothing. Perhaps the wind in the chimney?" Reverend Clark set down his cup and walked slowly around the room. He was listening intently now. Sarah prayed that Mato could keep Wichangpi quiet, but babies could not always be controlled. The child was probably hungry or uncomfortable in the dark cellar. The Reverend stopped directly over the trapdoor. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Then, miraculously, she heard horses approaching. Multiple horses. The Reverend heard them too and moved to the window. A group of settlers rode into the yard, including Mrs. Peterson and her husband. "Reverend Clark," Mrs. Peterson called, "we have been looking for you. There is trouble at the Johnsons' farm. Their son has fallen ill, and they need your prayers immediately." The Reverend hesitated, clearly torn between his suspicions and his duty. Duty won. He grabbed his hat and hurried toward the door. "I must go, Sister Sarah. But I will return soon to continue our conversation." Sarah watched them all ride away, then nearly collapsed with relief. She rushed to the trap door and opened it. Mato climbed out, holding a crying Wichangpi. The baby's face was red from crying. "That was too close," Sarah said, taking the baby and immediately nursing her to calm her down. "He almost discovered you." Mato's face was grave. "He knows something is wrong. You will come back." Sarah knew he was right. The Reverend would not let this go. He would watch the cabin, ask questions, investigate. It was only a matter of time before their secret was exposed. That night, after Wichangpi was asleep, Sarah and Mato sat by the fire and faced the truth they had been avoiding. This situation could not continue. Winter was coming, and with it, more isolation and more danger. If they were discovered, Mato would be arrested or killed. Sarah would be branded a traitor, and Wichangpi would be taken away. "You need to leave," Sarah said quietly, though the words hurt to speak. "Take Wichangpi and go before the Reverend returns." Mato looked at the sleeping baby, then at Sarah. "Where do we go? My people are scattered. The reservations are far. Winter comes soon." "There is a reservation to the north," Sarah said. "Perhaps 2 weeks' travel if you move quickly. Take my horse. Take all the supplies you can carry. Go now while you have time." "Your horse is all you have," Mato protested. "How will you survive winter without it?" "I will manage," Sarah said firmly. "I managed before. I will manage again. But Wichangpi needs her father. and you need to be safe. They spent that night preparing. Sarah packed food, blankets, supplies. She gave Mato her warmest coat for the baby. She showed him the best route north, the places where he might find shelter, the landmarks to watch for. As dawn broke, everything was ready. Mato strapped the supplies to the horse while Sarah held Wichangbi one last time. The baby smiled at her, reaching for Sarah's face with chubby hands. Sarah memorized every detail, the shape of her eyes, the curve of her cheeks, the way her hair curled at her neck. "Grow strong," Sarah whispered to her. "Be brave. Remember that you are loved." Mato took his daughter and secured her carefully in a carrier he had made. Then he turned to Sarah and did something unexpected. He removed Winona's beaded bracelet from his pouch and held it out to Sarah. "No," Sarah protested. "That belonged to your wife." "It should go to Wichangbi." Mato pressed it into her hand, closing her fingers around it. "You gave my daughter life. You gave us both life. My wife would want you to have this. Wichangbi will have other things to remember her mother, but this is for you to remember us." Tears streamed down Sarah's face as she accepted the gift. The beadwork was exquisite, clearly made with love and skill. She slipped it onto her wrist. Mato mounted the horse with Wichangbi secure against his chest. He looked down at Sarah, and she saw tears in his eyes, too. "Thank you," he said in careful English. "You saved us. We will never forget." "Be safe," Sarah managed to say. "Protect her. Tell her about this when she is older. Tell her that she was loved by more people than she knew." Mato nodded. Then, with a final look at the cabin where his daughter had been saved, he turned the horse north and rode away. Sarah stood in the yard until they disappeared from sight. The prairie stretched empty before her. Her arms felt hollow again. Her cabin would be silent once more. But this time, the emptiness felt different. This time, she had chosen it. She had given up something precious so that others could live. When Reverend Clark returned the next day with 2 army officers, they found Sarah alone. They searched the entire property but found no evidence of anyone else. The Reverend was certain she had been hiding someone, but without proof they could do nothing. The settlement's judgment was swift and harsh. Some people called Sarah a traitor, though they had no proof of what she had done. Others simply avoided her, uncomfortable with the suspicions surrounding her. Mrs. Peterson still visited occasionally, but their friendship was strained. Miss Clara stopped coming entirely. Sarah endured it all quietly. She wore the beaded bracelet every day, hidden under her sleeve. At night, she would take it out and look at the intricate patterns, remembering the baby who had brought purpose back to her life. Years passed slowly. Sarah continued to work her land alone. She spoke little and kept to herself. Some people forgot about the scandal, others never did. Then, one autumn day in 1882, 5 years after Mato had ridden away, Sarah had a visitor. A Lakota woman rode up to the cabin on a sturdy horse. She was young, perhaps 20, and she spoke perfect English. "Mrs. Mitchell?" the woman asked. "Mrs. Sarah Mitchell?" "Yes," Sarah said cautiously. "Who are you?" The woman smiled. "My name is Zintka. I was sent by Mato. He wanted you to know that he and his daughter are well. They live peacefully now on the reservation." Wichangbi is 7 years old and healthy and happy. Sarah's knees went weak with relief. "Thank God. I have worried all these years." Zintka dismounted and retrieved a bundle from her horse. "Mato sent you this. He wanted you to have it." Sarah unwrapped the bundle with shaking hands. Inside was a beautifully crafted cradle board, intricately carved and decorated with beadwork, and on the side, worked carefully in beads, was her name. "Sarah, Wichangbi knows about you," Zintka said softly. "Her father tells her the story of the white woman who fed her when the world turned its back. She calls you her milk mother." Sarah pressed the cradle board to her chest, tears flowing freely. Along with it was a small photograph, the only one Mato had been able to obtain. It showed him standing with a young girl, Wichangbi. She was beautiful and strong, looking directly at the camera with confident eyes. Sarah treasured that photograph and the cradle board for the rest of her life. She never married again, never had other children, but she did not die alone and forgotten. When Sarah Mitchell passed away in 1904, she was buried with 2 things, Winona's beaded bracelet on her wrist and the photograph of Wichangbi tucked into her hands. The cradle board was donated to the settlement church, where it hung as a mysterious artifact that no one could fully explain. But those who knew the true story, and there were a few, understood what it represented. It was a symbol of compassion crossing the boundaries of hatred. It was proof that even in the darkest times, kindness could flourish. It was a reminder that love, in all its forms, was stronger than fear. And somewhere on a northern reservation, a woman named Wichong Pai told her own children about a white woman named Sarah, who had saved her life when she was a baby, who had given everything and asked for nothing, who had loved her as her own. The story passed down through generations, a testament to the power of one person's choice to see humanity instead of an enemy, to offer life instead of death, to choose love instead of hate.